and new suspicions involving Russia. First, quote, "We are investigating grave sabotage." That's according to authorities in Finland who have boarded and seized an oil tanker traveling from Russia. The ship is suspected of dragging its anchor and causing the Christmas Day outage of an undersea power cable and 3 internet lines connecting Finland and Estonia. And there are also growing suspicions of Russian involvement in the Christmas Day crash of a passenger plane in Central Asia. Today, state media in Azerbaijan, where the flight originated, is reporting that the preliminary investigation finds, quote, "physical and technical interference caused the disaster." We have a lot to cover this busy Friday morning. Joining us now is CNN contributor Jill Doherty, a former CNN Moscow bureau chief, Major Glenn Ignazio, retired Air Force Special Operations Commander and a national security expert, and CNN political and national security analyst David Sanger. He is also the White House and national security correspondent for the New York Times and the author of New Cold Wars, China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West. Thank you all so much for coming on. So, Major Ignazio, I want to start with you. What do you make of that cryptic description leading up to that plane crash, physical and technical interference?
Yeah, it's very interesting as far as the first indications, or at least reports, were bird strike and so forth. And aircraft are designed to be able to take that without damage. But when you look at the actual physical evidence of the photographs, the holes are very precise and they're not indicative of something happening in flight from an engine or an air structure problem. So this is definitely something that is taken from outside. It does look more about AAA aircraft or a possible missile shrapnel, and the damage to the hydraulics and so forth would indicate why they had problems flying the aircraft. In addition to this, they also encountered jamming for GPS jamming, and this was because Ukraine was actually launching some drones south of the Grozny area, about 100 miles away. So it really looks like this was an interference with AAA missiles and definitely damage outside of the aircraft, not from the aircraft.
So, Jill, what is the significance if Russia is to blame? Are there international consequences here?
Well, I don't know that we know exactly what the consequences would be, but you have to look at the way Russia has dealt with it so far. Essentially, it said, we can't make any comment. We have to wait until we have more information. But it does very much remind me of 2014 when I was in Moscow and I covered the MH17 shoot down of a Malaysian plane. Mm-hmm. And that was also connected with, a war. At that point, it was kind of percolating in Ukraine, and some partisans who were connected with Russia used a Buk missile, which is a Russian missile, to shoot that plane down. And the Russians never acknowledged that. In fact, to this day, as far as I know, they have not. So I'm not surprised that they're not saying much, but there's a lot of evidence that's coming out at this point, as we just heard. So we'll have to see how they handle it. But it would be very bad and embarrassing for the Russian military, no question.
Right, and we're looking at pictures right now on the screen of that tragic Malaysia Airlines Flight 17. David, I mean, as Jill just said, Russia never accepted blame for that. Would you expect anything different if these findings point to Russia?
Pam, I wouldn't, but it's worth remembering what happened after the 2014 shootdown. There was an international commission that was put together, somewhat similar to what was assembled yesterday for this disaster. It took them about a year and a half, nearly 2 years, to come up with a conclusion. As Jill just said, the Russians never acknowledged what the commission concluded, which was that it was shot down with that Russian-made Buk. Nobody suggested it was deliberate, but certainly seemed to be happening in a war zone, as this was. And did the Russians face a penalty? They got some fairly mild sanctions. And the same year, the German government, under Chancellor Angela Merkel, signed the Nord Stream 2 agreement with Russia to build a new gas pipeline to Europe, one that was proceeding until the war started 3 years ago, the invasion of Ukraine. So I think it would be very easy for the Russians to conclude that the West isn't terribly serious about sanctions, and doesn't have a lot left to sanction.
Well, because they think they have all the leverage, right? Given that deal that you just talked about, we're in the winter months right now.
Well, that's right. I mean, the deal itself was ultimately upended by the invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. The Germans pulled out. But the fact of the matter is that the Russians came out of that concluding that if you just wait a few years, the United States will, its Western allies will lose interest and move on. And with the new administration coming in, whose interest in continuing to fund the Ukrainians is somewhat doubtful at this point, they probably have every reason to think that their best strategy at this point is deny everything and wait for it to blow over. Now, the cables are a more complicated thing because that would be a deliberate act. And again, though, limited reaction and sanctions.
So let's talk a little bit more about that, Major. Finland seizing this ship as part of its investigation into the cutting of undersea cables. How important are these cables? And how would a country like Russia benefit from cutting them, Major?
Yeah, it is rather significant because in that Baltic area, there's 9 NATO countries that surround that area. And so it's really critical that the communications between the countries, both for commerce and also in military communications, will continue. To give you an idea how significant it is, now we may use satellites in the military and so forth, and even the fastest satellite communication for internet, the cable is 1,000 times faster and can carry more data. So those undersea cables are really critical for all use, commercial, military, and so forth. So what Russia can do by doing this is really deteriorate some of the operations and concerns of anything that could go on with a NATO country talking to another NATO country. In addition, this also hits some of the power lines that were underneath. So you're talking about impacting infrastructure, which would be one of the things that Russia would do to cause any kind of problems or intimidation. And as we saw only 30 days ago, a Chinese ship was accused of dragging and hitting 2 other internet cable lines. So this is very interesting to see this within 30 days, and these are significant impacts to the entire region as a whole.
So to extend on that point you just made, Major Jill, to bring you in, Baltic Sea nations are on high alert for these potential acts of sabotage following the string of outages of power cables, telecom links, and gas pipelines. It's been going on for at least 2 years. Is Russia suspected in all of these outages? What do you think of it?
I think significant in this, no question, is that Russia wants to retaliate against the West, against NATO, because it does consider itself at war with NATO. So how do you do that without starting a nuclear war? You do it with hybrid other types of operations. And there hasn't been a lot of reporting on this, but there already is sabotage going on by Russians in Europe. And this could be just another example of that. And they're hard to pin down. You know, the first incident with the Chinese ship, well, who owns it? Well, it's not Russia. Were they just dragging the cable? Was this just a mistake? And some of the same questions are coming up. Could this have been a mistake? But I think it's too significant. The neighborhood and the cables that were cut between 2 important NATO allies. So this is, I think, another example of Russia trying to get back at the West.
David, I want to bring you in just to look big picture here and looking ahead. When Donald Trump takes office again, Vladimir Putin recently said he hasn't talked to Trump in 4 years. Trump won't say anything about him talking to Putin during the transition. He wants to keep it vague, but he has talked about wanting to end the war in Ukraine and striking a deal. How do you see this playing out once he takes office?
Well, when we first heard President-elect Trump on this, he said he would solve the war in 24 hours. He's since said, well, it may be more complicated than that. Maybe, he said, even more complicated than the Middle East. That's been pretty, I think, obvious to anybody who's been sort of deeply engaged in watching this for some time. A few things, Pam. First, we don't know whether Vladimir Putin's really interested in negotiation. He said yesterday he was, but as the White House just said, and John Kirby, the spokesman for the National Security Council, said he isn't acting like somebody who is deeply interested in a negotiation. Maybe he's just waiting for Inauguration Day. Second is the question of, if there isn't a negotiation, are the Ukrainians front and center to it? Or is this something that gets worked out between President Putin and President Trump, and then President Trump goes to the Ukrainians and says, you'll take this deal if you want continued help? And the third question is, what kind of security guarantee would Ukraine get? It's not a NATO member. Would other European countries, as they've suggested, come in and put troops in, peacekeepers, along the line? Would the United States continue to supply arms and intelligence? We just don't know. And these are all things Putin's going to want to test.
All right. Thank you so much, David Sanger, Major Glenn Ignazio, and Jill Doherty. We appreciate your time on this holiday week.